Hi, I'm Wendy Turner, Executive Director of Michigan Public. You might have heard that public media is under threat. You're not wrong. But I come to tell you that your voice has power. Visit protectmypublicmedia.org, contact your lawmakers, and take a stand today.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
This campaign will start by finding out what you think.
With Mike Duggan's announcement that he is running for governor, it just showcases this absolutely transitional moment in Detroit and Michigan politics.
The city next year will have a race for mayor, the first without Duggan's name in a decade. And this week marks the 10-year anniversary of the city emerging from the nation's largest municipal bankruptcy.
And so today, who better to turn to than the one and only Stephen Henderson, host of American Black Journal, and the brilliant Nancy Kaffer, editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Hello, you both.
Hey.
Well, you wonder why we come here.
First, let's talk about this mayoral race and Detroit politics next year. So much this year we've been talking about sort of vibe elections. Stephen, let's start with you. What's just the vibe right now when it comes to Detroit politics?
That's a great question because we just had this really surprising election result that I think those of us who have covered politics in the city for a long time had predicted something very different was going to happen. And we're about to go into maybe the biggest political year in this century in Detroit. This idea of a three-term mayor who's going to step away, who's changed the city dramatically while he's been there, and the big questions about who's next? What will that person face, and what will they be able to do going forward? If I had to use one word, it wouldn't be a word. It would be punctuation. It would be a question mark. I have no idea what's happening.
I think that it is definitely going to be an interesting year. That was really insightful, wasn't it? We've got a lot of candidates who are rumored to be running. We've got a couple of candidates who have emerged so far. My instinct is that the field isn't set yet. I think we're going to see a couple of more big names get into the mix because there is not currently, there are very strong, very competitive candidates. There's not one candidate who's like, oh, they're going to run away with this. And I think that's going to feel like an opportunity for a lot of people. I'm glad about that. I think it's good to have a robust primary and a robust race. But the mood here, as Stephen said, it's interesting. Detroiters voted for change a lot in 2009 for a charter commission for Dave Bing, who was an outsider. Then in 2013 for Mike Duggan, who moved here to run for mayor, who was a white man in an era when people thought there would never be a white mayor again. But Detroiters have been voting for change. Then they sort of held firm on Mike Duggan for a while. Right. But what's the appetite now?
Well, and that's exactly my question. Stephen, you talking about this end of an era. I mean, it's really not the end of the chapter. Like, it is an end of a book.
I think so.
It feels like. Are there candidates right now that you see aligned with Mike Duggan's vision of the city, or is it going to be candidates rebelling against? Like, what are we going to see?
So far, what I found very interesting about all the candidates is how praising they are of Duggan. They all take the opportunity to talk about the positive things that have happened over the last 10, 11 years and the direction that the city is headed. What we're not hearing from them yet is what they want to do with that. What's left to do. There are lots and lots of problems still visiting on Detroiters and their neighborhoods. There are things that are kind of crumbling right now that Duggan has kind of stood up, and challenges that he didn't face that the next mayor will have to deal with. And so we're not hearing yet what they want to do. Like, how do you want to keep things moving forward? But they all say, Mike Duggan changed the city and changed it for the better. I haven't heard a single person yet say, well, I don't love this focus on downtown or midtown. I don't love the corporate influence that he's kind of allowed to run much more aggressively through city politics and development than before. I never run across people who say the city is worse now than it was before. And so I think if you were running in that way and talking that way, I think you'd kind of find yourself at odds with a lot of the people you need to vote for you.
I actually have talked to people who feel the city is worse, but there aren't enough of them to sway an election. And I think you won't.
And do they
hear
really
a lot
feel
of
that way,
candidates.
or are they just picking at?
I think they feel that way because police or widening inequity. I mean, I don't think that they would say that these things, sort of objectively are bad or not better, but the consequences of some of the things that we would point to as triumphs. But I don't think you will hear a serious or likely to be successful candidate in this race criticize Duggan because, as you said, when abandoned houses in your neighborhood have been taken down or when you have more streetlights, the person who did those things is not coming out and criticizing that those things happened is not going to be a winning strategy. But that creates a very interesting campaign in which we'll see folks trying to present what they would do differently against the backdrop of what Mike Duggan has accomplished, which we also have to remember came in the middle of Detroit's bankruptcy, which fundamentally changed the balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
And he started office with advantages that no other mayor has had or will have in terms of his ability to get stuff done. So that whoever succeeds him is also going to be coming into a little bit of a loaded situation.
Do you think that he's on track to become one of those legendary Detroit mayors like a Frank Murphy, or even going back to Hazen Pingree, who's got this really great story of trying to be Detroit mayor and governor of Michigan at the same time? Mm-hmm. But is he on track to be one of those types of mayors?
I don't see how he cannot be one of the mayors that sticks out in the Detroit timeline. I mean, the nature of what he accomplished, even in getting elected as a write-in candidate after he didn't qualify for the primary ballot, and then during the bankruptcy and presiding over the aftermath of the bankruptcy and so much investment, I don't see how he cannot be one of the Detroit mayors that is a big type in the history.
Yeah, I mean, if just on the meter of what did you change in the job, I mean, I think he easily qualifies as one of the most influential. But there's also something else about the mayor that I think is not as understood maybe outside the city. So when I was a kid, I used to have to go around every 4 years and help campaign for Coleman Young. And
another legendary.
Doors. Yeah, right. The legendary. Yes, I had two uncles who were members of the administration, and they would drag us along. And you'd knock doors and talk to people, and occasionally the mayor would come with. You'd watch people react to him when they saw him on their doorstep or on their street. And I've not seen anyone else in Detroit get that kind of reaction since Coleman Young, other than Mike Duggan. Even Kwame Kilpatrick, who was very, very popular as mayor, didn't attract the same kind of enthusiasm that people have when they see Mike Duggan. And the number of people who have seen Mike Duggan is also important, right? He started his campaign with these living room talks, and, you'd invite your friends over. He'd come over and talk to them about what was going on in the city, what he wanted to do. He's been doing that now for 10 years. And so, by my estimation, I don't know, maybe half the population of Detroit has actually sat in a living room with the mayor and talked to him. And he is so good at connecting with people who I think would naturally be skeptical of him because he's not really a Detroiter, and he's very different from them, but he's so great at making that connection. And I think that catapults him in many people's eyes to that legendary status. We're very emotional about mayors in Detroit. It's not just about what they do. We want to love them. We want to feel like we know them.
But only 18% of registered voters turned out in the last municipal election.
Well, that's true.
So we have at some level a disconnect between Detroiters who are eligible to vote and their interest in voting. Municipal turnout in off years, because Detroit votes in 21, 25, and 29. It's not a gubernatorial or presidential year. Big city turnout in off years is normally low. Like 36% is a good number for off year big city election turnout. We're half of that. I think this should be a 5-alarm fire. And in fact, pay attention to the Free Press next year, because we're going to do a lot of reporting into what's happening there in the opinion section.
We haven't had a
fascinating question.
We haven't had a real contest for mayor since Mike Duggan ran the first time in 2013. He runs against Benny Napoleon, who was a really credible, I think, candidate, and came closest. Since then, Coleman Young, the younger Coleman Young, was his opponent, and then Anthony Adams in the third election. I'm not sure that it's about Mike Duggan, whether people are turning out so much as it is about whether people think there's much of a choice.
Whether it's competitive or not.
I feel like if it wasn't 18%, I could buy there's an old political saw that if people aren't voting or they're not coming out or doing whatever, then they're fine with the status quo. If it were 30%, I would endorse that, but 18% is
pathetic.
It's just such a small number of voters.
So let's talk about the raw politics of this. We're not shocked that Mike Duggan is running for governor. We're shocked that he is running as an independent. And so I guess just on two tracks, does the story of Mike Duggan and what he's accomplished in Detroit, does it sell statewide? And what does the fact that he's running without a party affiliation, even though he is a Democrat, what does that say?
Nancy, you want to go first?
What was the question? No, I wrote a piece in 2022 where I looked at Democratic turnout in rural Michigan counties. Governor Whitmer got 750,000 votes in counties that otherwise went for her Republican competitor, Tudor Dixon. There are more Democratic votes in the rest of the state than there are in Detroit by a lot. And I worry about this also because the sort of lack of interest in improving voter turnout in Detroit hasn't made us less relevant. Can we command the attention and fealty or responsibility of statewide elected Democrats when Detroit's vote has become such a sliver of what's getting them elected? Because we all know that people, they play to the cheap seats, right? So if we're not coming out here in Detroit, what does that say to whoever is running? There's obviously some voters who are going to be like, yes, of course, Mike Duggan, thank goodness, he turned Detroit around, which is such a simplistic narrative. But there's still so many people statewide who hear Detroit and they think crime and dysfunction. So that's a huge uphill climb to get over those long-standing prejudices about the city.
But then, Stephen, is that some of the reason why you're seeing this political calculation from Duggan say, I'm an independent in all these different ways?
I think he's got to make himself stand out in that field, and that's different than trying to stand out among candidates for mayor in Detroit, right? Fewer people in the state actually know much about him. If they associate him with the city and they have a negative opinion of the city, that's not going to help him. This puts him in a new space where he's saying, oh, I'm not maybe what you expect or think. I think the timing of this is fascinating because
interesting.
This is a state that it's interesting, as Nancy would say. This is a state where you saw Democrats cross over to vote for the Republican nominee for president. You saw a lot of Democrats. But only at the top of the ballot. But only at the top of the ballot. You saw a lot of Democrats just not vote. And so if Mike Duggan had come out and said, I want to be governor and I'm going to run as a Democrat, in some ways, he would be inheriting the mantle of a party that people seem to be running from, right? This way, he gets to eschew all of that and say, I'm a new guy and I got new ideas.
In 2024, Democrats took a bath. In 2 years, especially if the Trump administration does all, some of the things folks were worried it will, and there's pushback. This is how it works, right? One party gets pasted, and then 2 years later, something different happens, and 2 years after that, something different happens. So I think if that's the calculation, I'm not sure that works because.
Well, I think the calculation is that the partisanship, that both the seesawing.
Well, it's a plague on both your houses, right? It's being able to run against.
It's not saying I'm for Trump. Also, he's saying I don't like either of them.
I expect Mike Duggan to get a significant number of Democratic votes. Where is the evidence that Republicans are willing to cross the aisle to vote for someone who doesn't have an R by their name?
I've had 5 conversations with big Republican fundraisers since the announcement who told me they didn't have time to talk because they needed to figure out how to get Mike Duggan elected governor. So, and it was a surprise. I was like, oh, really? And they had all these reasons.
Big Republican donors get 1 vote each.
But they have a lot of money.
Do we think the other candidates are going to get big donations? None of them are slouches.
It is going to be absolutely fascinating to watch, and we will continue to watch this and talk to you both about how this plays out. But before we end, a pretty monumental anniversary. This week marks a decade since the city of Detroit emerged from bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. Stephen, let's start with you. How are you thinking about this anniversary?
So, gotta admit up front, didn't know it was an anniversary. I
did before we started. I'm like, and I want to talk about the 10 years.
Like, really?
You said, has it really been 10 years?
You might want to stop and get flowers
right.
on your way home.
So, I mean, there's no question the city is fundamentally a different place now than it was then. We were so low at the beginning of that bankruptcy. I mean, I really just remember this somber, almost funereal kind of feeling about what was happening and what might happen. You know, the end of the bankruptcy brought us to this point where it was obvious we had opportunity. Wrote a column at the end of the bankruptcy that apparently I don't remember writing on this day that talked about the responsibility each of us had as Detroiters to make the most of this and to do things, actively do things to take advantage of it. And I think by almost every measure that's happened in the last 10 years. I mean, the city is just alive in a way that I haven't seen since I was a very small child in terms of activity and intensity and just kind of positive momentum. At the same time, we still have a lot of challenges. It's such a big city and geographically, and there are so many deep problems that we haven't gotten to. This week I was headed to Loyola High School over on the west side in Detroit and got off at the wrong exit. Ended up driving down Fenkell between Livernois and Wyoming to get there. I was stunned at how much this vibrant commercial corridor, which was how I would have remembered it as a child, has just become nothing. It's full of dead businesses still. And so that's what sits in front of us. What about the folks who live around those areas? How do they feel about the last 10 years? We haven't reached those areas in ways that have fundamentally changed others. And so it's literally a tale of two cities, right? We always talked about there being two Detroits as kind of a negative. I think it's more of a neutral assessment at this point that there's great things happening in many, many places, not just downtown and midtown, but lots of neighborhoods. But there are also wide swaths of the city that just are desperate for something to happen, and we haven't figured out yet what that is.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, 10 years on, how are you thinking about it?
You know, anytime I hear someone express trepidation about a Detroit neighborhood, that maybe they don't feel safe or they don't want to drive through it, or I always want to remind them that there's children who walk to school through the neighborhood. Whatever neighborhood they're talking about, there are children who walk to school through the neighborhood. Stephen is right. There is so much amazing stuff happening, and there is also so much need here. And you know, every mayor has faced this challenge of, do you care more about the neighborhoods or downtown? Mike Duggan rejected the label, that the idea that there were two Detroits, but you really don't have to drive around very much or walk around very much before you realize the truth of that. There's so much to be done, and the need is so dramatic. We've just got so much to do, and we still have to maintain the work that has happened, the progress that has been made. I think it's maybe even harder now than it was 10 years ago, because it's maintaining this and also growing that.
Well, we're going to leave it there, but just two folks that we absolutely wanted to turn to. Nancy Kaffer, editorial page editor at the Detroit Free Press, and Stephen Henderson, host of American Black Journal. Thank you two just so much.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.